Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Football Council. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the solidarity mechanism. And then we're going to also compare it at the end with similarities and differences with training compensation. But without further ado, let's just dive into our topic for tonight. So solidarity mechanism has to be understood as a part of a more integral and broader system of compensation of training of young players, which also includes training compensation. Pursuant to that end, definition 27 of the regulations on the status and transfer of players, namely RSTP, defines training rewards as the mechanisms which compensate training clubs for their role in the training and education of young players, namely training compensation pursuant to Article 20 of the regulations, and the solidarity mechanism pursuant to Article 21 of the regulations, which we're going to get in more deep in detail in this session. So Article 21 of the RSTP in regards to solidarity mechanism states that if a professional is transferred before the expiry of his contract, any club that has contributed to his education and training shall receive a proportion of the compensation paid to his former club solidarity contribution. These provisions concerning solidarity contributions are set out in Annex 5 of these regulations. So the main points to consider here are that Article 21 of the RSTP summarizes the main principles of the system, and just like the training compensation system, the technical details are set out in the respective annex, in this case, Annex 5. Also, the obligation to pay solidarity mechanism arises only if a contract is in force. Therefore, the transfer this is very important. The transfer of the player must be made before the expiry of the professional's contract with the releasing club. This is somewhat of a difference with training compensation also, because as we know, the movement of a player from one team to another can be made at the end of the contract in the case of training compensation. Also, the principles of solidarity mechanism do apply to women's football. This is another difference with training compensation, which we will talk about later on. So now we're going to go further into more detail, and now in Annex 5, Article 1, pursuant also to solidarity contribution. It states the following. 1, if a professional moves during the course of a contract, 5% of any compensation paid within the scope of this transfer, not including training compensation paid to his former club, shall be deducted from the total amount of this compensation and distributed by the new club as a solidarity contribution to the clubs involved in his training and education over the years. This solidarity contribution reflects the number of years calculated pro rata if less than 1 year he was registered with the relevant club or clubs between the calendar years of his 12th and 23rd birthday. And then the article makes a breakdown per calendar year. As we can see, the first years of training, the amount payable to the clubs is less. And the rationale behind it is that usually clubs invest more money and incurring more costs as the player is more developed through the years. So from the calendar year of the 12th birthday of the player to the calendar year of the 15th birthday of the player, the training club will receive 5% of any compensation. And after that, that is to say, from the calendar year of the 16th birthday of the player up to the end of the calendar year of the 23rd birthday of the player, the training clubs will receive 10% of 5% of any compensation related to that transfer. Number 2 of the Article 1 of Annex 5 states that a training club is entitled to receive a portion of the 5% solidarity contribution in 2 scenarios, 2 cases. A professional is transferred either on a definitive or a loan basis between clubs affiliated to different member associations. And then B, a professional player is transferred either on a definitive or loan basis between clubs, but this time affiliated to the same association, provided that the training clubs at the base are affiliated to different associations than those of the clubs that the transfer was made. So then in regards to the scope of the solidarity mechanism, we got that in Article 1, Annex 5. The solidarity contribution corresponds to 5% of any compensation, not including training compensation, and paid by the new club to the professional player's former club for the transfer of the registration of the player. This solidarity contribution, therefore, is linked to the transfer compensation agreed between the professional players' new and former clubs. Also, the solidarity contribution applies to any transfer of the player throughout their career. This is another difference in regard to training compensation that we're going to see in further detail as we go in this session. Okay, the main principles of solidarity mechanism. The most basic precondition is for applying to the solidarity mechanism is that a professional player must move between two clubs affiliated to different member associations while they're still under contract. Remember, there has to be a contract valid and enforced. Also, Article 1 of Annex 5 of the RSTP was amended to make clear that any compensation paid within the scope of a transfer is subject to solidarity mechanism, regardless of whether it's described as a part of the transfer fee or not. Any compensation, exception being made, of course, of training compensation, is not taken into account for the calculation. The amount by reference to which the solidarity contribution is calculated is, as a principle, always the transfer fee in question. We're going to see an example where that's not the case, but in principle, it's always the transfer fee that is used as the base to calculate the solidarity due. We have also in this presentation pinpointed out some CAS awards and dispute resolution decisions that better illustrate the solidarity mechanism. In this case, we have identified CAS case 2020-8-7281 for you to study, if you so wish to. In this award, CAS explained that a player's market value is irrelevant for the purposes of solidarity contributions. Again, the relevant factor is the agreed transfer price. It's very important. The only compensation, again, which is not subject to the 5% solidarity contribution, is training compensation. Training compensation is not is utilized in the calculation of the 5% solidarity contribution. So now let's talk a little bit about buyout clauses in the context of the solidarity mechanism. To that end, we have also chosen another CAS award, namely CAS award identified as 2011-8-2356, that is SS Lazio versus Vélez Sarsfield and FIFA. But before that, the DRC has consistently concluded that the solidarity contribution is due whenever a player moves between two clubs after triggering the buyout clause. Okay, in other words, if there's a buyout clause in place in a contract between a player and a club, if the new club pays in full that buyout fee without condition, then solidarity compensation is due to the training clubs. Every time, buyout clauses, if they are complied with, it generates solidarity mechanism. That's important to keep in mind. So now in the award that we just pointed out, the CAS panel considered that by including a buyout clause in its employment contract with the player, and this is very important, the club had effectively given its consent in advance to release the player from his contractual obligations in return for the payment of the specified amount. In view of this, the original decision of the DRC was confirmed and a solidarity contribution was awarded to the training club. Furthermore, in another CAS award, this one is identified as 2021-8-8543 as Paris Saint-Germain Football versus Football Club Barcelona. That's the famous Neymar case. The panel found out that a predetermined buyout fee set out in a buyout clause is not materially different from a negotiated transfer fee for the purposes of the solidarity mechanism. This is very important again, guys. The buyout fee is to be considered as an offer that remains valid throughout the term of the employment contract. So these two awards establish two important ideas. One, that a buyout clause constitute a previous consent by the releasing club that is going to be valid throughout the existence of the contract, and also it is an offer that remains valid throughout the term of the employment contract. So it's an authorization, a consent, and also an offer in terms of the interpretation that CAS makes of buyout clauses pertaining to solidarity mechanism. Very important to keep this in mind always. Then, therefore, not applying the solidarity mechanism to buyout clauses would give clubs an easy way to torpedo, or in other words, circumvent efforts to foster within the football community. And again, that is contrary to RSTP regulations. For a buyout clause to be properly exercised, the agreed sum must be paid unconditionally with no deductions of any kind. This translates that the solidarity contribution should be paid by the player's new club on top of the amount stipulated in the buyout clause. This is backed up and confirmed by decisions of the DRC, as well as CAS awards that we have put in there for your perusal and study if you so desire. But this is important because the general rule, as we will see, is that 5% of the transfer price should be deducted and then paid to the relevant training clause. In this case, when you pay the buyout clause, you pay the full price of the fee, the full price, and on top of that price, you will have to pay the 5% solidarity mechanism. So it would be 100% of the fee plus 5%, right? And that's the calculation you should make in case of buyout clauses. So now let's talk about settlement agreements related to the move of a player in the context of a solidarity mechanism. So for this example, we have chosen the CAS Award 2020-8-7291. That's a Club Atlético de Madrid, Sociedad Anónima Deportiva, and Sporting Club de Portugal, Futebol, Sociedad Anónima Deportiva versus Club Futebol Benfica. In that award, CAS noted that a solidarity payment is due if the player moves to a new club while his employment contract is still in force. It doesn't say transfer, but it says move, right? It held that the concept of movement of a player from one club to another is not restricted by the necessity that such movement takes place in accordance with a typical transfer. That doesn't have to be a typical transfer, but in essence, the player moves from club A to club B. That happens, we're going to see down the road what's the treatment. In the indicated award, CAS also determined that due to the fact that the player moved out of his contract when this was still in force, in this case through unilateral termination, and consequently moved to the new club, this must be construed as falling within the scope of Annex 5. So this example that we're using, the scenario is the following. Basically, the player terminated unilaterally his contract with Hoyos Cos with his former club, and now the former club and the new club are going to enter into an agreement in which they're going to settle an amount, an indemnity amount, and we're going to see what CAS, how CAS treats this, and what are the effects. So, in addition, the term compensation was not meant to be construed narrowly as merely encompassing a transfer fee, but rather has encompassing any amount paid by the new club to the old club as a result of the player's move from the latter to the former. So it doesn't need to be necessarily a transfer, and the money paid, the compensation doesn't have to be necessarily a transfer fee, but any sum paid has a consequence of a player moving from a club to another one. The indemnity stipulated in the settlement agreement should be considered as compensation, and a solidarity contribution was therefore due. Again, there was a breach of contract by the player. The former club and the new club agree on an indemnity amount. That indemnity amount triggers the right to solidarity contribution. Okay. Now we're going to see a different scenario, somewhat different. It's very similar in the sense that there is a breach of contract, but there's no settlement agreement between the two clubs. The consequences are a lot different. So, in the CAS Award 2011-8-2356, Lazio versus Vélez Sarsfield and FIFA that we already spoke about, the CAS panel considered that the key elements of a transfer between two clubs for the purposes of the solidarity mechanism were all these criteria have to be met in order for the transaction to be considered a transfer. One, the consent of the releasing club to the early termination of its contract with the player. Two, the willingness and consent of the new club to secure the player's services for itself. Three, of course, the consent of the player to move from one club to another. And finally, of course, also the price or value of the transaction. If one of these conditions is not met, we're not talking about a transfer. So in the event of an unjustified breach of contract, at least two of these criteria for a valid transfer are not met. Specifically, the consent of the club of origin to the early termination of its contract with the player, and the need for there to be a price or value associated with the transaction. As a result, an unjustified breach of contract cannot be deemed to be a transfer between clubs for the purposes of solidarity mechanism. So in other words, since there is a breach of contract by the player, no right to solidarity compensation arises because there's a breach of contract. What's different the scenario where there was a breach of contract and the two clubs agreed on a settlement and an indemnity. That indemnity did get the right to solidarity compensation. So in line with all what that's been said, the solidarity mechanism does not apply to any compensation paid by the player or jointly by the club for breach of contract. Now, ¿alguna pregunta, Dani? Any questions? Let me see. Okay, thanks. So let's talk about now different scenario. This is when, in regards to solidarity mechanism, always exchange of a professional players or swap deals. Yeah, what is customary, or at least in our minds, right, is that one club pays for the transfer of another of a player to another club, and then it can have its services, right? That is, we exchange the player for money, right? Or the registration rights of the player for money. This is not the case. Also, two clubs may decide instead to exchange or swap two or more professional players. In this case, it's highly unlikely that a club will agree to such a deal unless it feels the monetary value between the two players involved are broadly similar. So we also have chosen a CAS Award 2016-8-4821 Stoke City FC versus Pepsi Football Academy. In this award, the CAS panel pointed out that the RSCP referred to compensation without specifying its nature. Moreover, Swiss law supports the notion that this is very important, that we're going to see why, that an exchange of goods, in the present case, the rights to the player's respective registration would be the exchange of goods or the goods being exchanged, fundamentally involves two sales contracts. We're talking about two sales contracts under Swiss law when we swap players. In case of a player swap, the right to register one player constitutes, of course, the consideration in return for which the other club transfers the right to register its player. In order to preserve the spirit and substance of the solidarity mechanism, the dispute resolution chamber has confirmed that a solidarity contribution must be paid when the registration of professionals are exchanged in this way. So when there's a swap deal, solidarity contribution or solidarity compensation will arise, and it has to be paid accordingly. We'll see how. This is confirmed and backed by a bunch of DRC decisions. We have put some there for your perusal and studies if you so wish to do it. So CAS has confirmed this criteria by the DRC and also has stated that there is no basis on which to conclude that the rights being exchanged when players swap clubs are devoid of value, meaning that there is a value associated with the deal. And since there's value, there is the right to pay or the obligation to pay solidarity mechanism, depending on which part are you, the selling club or the engaging club. In another CAS award, CAS 2012-8-2929, that's K Football versus Toulouse SC. CAS has explained that where registration rights are exchanged and no additional compensation is provided by either party to the transaction, in this scenario, guys, these two players must be deemed to be of exactly equal value. This is only true if no additional compensation is provided by either party. Finally, and for the avoidance of doubt, and that's why it's important to understand that under Swiss law, it constitutes two contracts, two purchase contracts. If players are exchanged, the training clubs of both players will benefit from the solidarity contribution. So since both clubs are selling and engaging clubs, the clubs that train both players will benefit from the solidarity contribution. That's what it says. So now let's talk about calculation and payment. Like we spoke about, the general rule is 5% to be deducted from the compensation paid by the new club. So as per RSTP regulations, the 5% solidarity contribution must be deducted from the total amount of any transfer compensation paid by the new club. Remember, if exception is made in the case of buyout clauses where you have to pay the buyout clause in full and 5% solidarity contribution on top of that amount. That would be the exception. The solidarity mechanism does not impose any additional financial burden on the new club. But in the case of solidarity contribution also, is deducted from the amount of compensation agreed between the two clubs, and then it is distributed to the clubs entitled to receive it. So in principle, the former club should never receive the 100% of the transfer fee, unless it's the buyout clause, of course, because the engaging club, the new club, has to deduct the 5% and distribute it to the training clubs. Of course, this can happen. Sometimes it happens, and there's a way to deal with it, but it's on a case-by-case basis, of course. So OMB, responsibility to pay solidarity contribution, has stated it is the new club's responsibility to deduct the 5% solidarity contribution from the agreed transfer compensation and to distribute it to the clubs involved in the professional players training and education pursuant to RSTP regulations. Finally, in regards to this topic, for transfers that occur as from November 16, 2022, the distribution of solidarity mechanism will be processed through the FIFA clearinghouse pursuant to FIFA clearinghouse regulations. So entitlement to payment, we spoke about this at the beginning of the session, but we'll go again in a little bit more detail. So all clubs involved in training and educating a player between the calendar years of their 12th and 23rd birthday are entitled to solidarity contributions. In the event that the solidarity mechanism is triggered before January 1st, 2021, the criteria will change from calendar years to the season on which the player celebrates the relevant birthday. It will be seasons rather than calendar years if the event that triggers the solidarity mechanism happens before January 1st, 2020. So a training club has been entitled to receive a proportion of the 5% solidarity contribution, again, in two different situations. A, when a professional player transfers between clubs affiliated to different member associations, and B, a professional player transfers between clubs affiliated to the same member association, provided that the training clubs one training club affiliated to a different member association is affiliated to a different member association because it has an international dimension. Clubs or members of a same member association, but the training club at the basis is from another member association. That has an international dimension, and that triggers the application of the regulation on the status and transfer of players, namely the solidarity mechanism. And now the treatment of loans, the entitlement to payment. Where a professional player is loaned in return for the payment of a loan fee, 5% of that loan fee will be deducted as a solidarity contribution. It's basically the same treatment as a regular transfer, guys. Anytime there is an amount, even a compensation paid, even in case of a loan, 5% must be deducted by the paying club and distributed between the training clubs of the player. This means that solidarity contribution has to be deducted from the loan fee by the engaging club and distributed to the training clubs. Basically, that's what it says. So we're getting to the end of our session tonight. And as stated before at the beginning, we're going to talk about the main differences that exist between the solidarity mechanism and the training compensation system. So unlike training compensation, which is payable only once, if any, and in relation to a specific player, if the solidarity mechanism applies, it's payable in connection with every international transfer involving transfer compensation over the course of a player's career, with a contract in force, of course, and as well as to domestic transfers with an international dimension, like we spoke before in that would be the example number B that we went over before. For training compensation purposes, only the calendar years between the player's 12th and 21st birthdays are taken into consideration. On the flip side, clubs are entitled to solidarity payments for the player's entire training and education. That would be between the ages of 12 and 22. As far as training compensation is concerned, the amount payable is calculated based on a preset estimated training costs, which are published in the relevant FIFA circulars. On the other hand, or on the contrary, solidarity contributions are calculated as a percentage of an transfer compensation amount, usually. And solidarity mechanism only applies to the professional player moves before the contract expires. In contrast, we know that training compensation can be payable also if a professional player moves at the end of their contract. That is, as when it is a free agent. And finally, as spoken before, the principles of solidarity mechanism apply to women's football. But we do have to say that the principles of training compensation, even though they do not apply today to women's football, FIFA is making efforts to design a training compensation system specifically aimed to the realities of women. So thank you. I don't know if there are any questions, Dani. ¿Alguna pregunta? Aquí tengo una. Here's a question. Does a bio clause modify the solidarity mechanism? Okay, Jack, sorry about my French. It doesn't modify the solidarity mechanism per se, but yeah, it's a somewhat different treatment in the sense that, as spoken before, the general rule is that out of the amount paid has a transfer fee, you deduct 5% of the 100% of the amount, and you have to the paying club has to distribute that in to the training clubs, right, of the player. When you pay buyout clause, you have to pay the amount in full as stipulated in the contract, because that's the way to comply with the contract. So that's the reason why jurisprudence determines that paying the buyout clause in full, 100% of the buyout clause, on top of that, you have to pay the 5% solidarity contribution. So that would be the difference. Yeah, doesn't modify the system, but in this case, yeah, the payment is different, of course. I hope I've been clear enough. If not, my contacts are there. You can leave any question you may want, or contact me directly to answer any queries you may have. Gladly to do so. So I guess that's the only question, Danny. So if there are no more questions, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight, and also take the opportunity to invite you to next Wednesday's at the same hour session, and where we're going to be talking about third-party ownership and third-party interest, but we're going to be announcing that through our social media. So without nothing more to inform you at this point, and no further questions, until then, just be safe, guys.